Hello and welcome to the January episode of Shop Talk with Writers. I'm Elena Lapin, and my guest today is award-winning journalist and novelist Tom LAMONT. His debut novel, Going Home, is a loving, funny, and very moving story of a 2-year-old boy who is suddenly alone in the world, and 3 men who may and perhaps should give him a home while reflecting on where they themselves belong and how to live. Tom LAMONT, welcome to the podcast.
My name's Tom LAMONT. I'm an author and a journalist. I'm going to read a short extract from the very beginning of my debut novel, Going Home, which is out through Scepter in the UK and is coming out through Knopf in the US. This novel is a story of family, friendship, raising a small boy. It's about a group of friends in North London, and the story is told from their changing perspectives. You don't really see a lot of this story through the eyes of the 2-year-old boy at the centre of it, but the very beginning of the book is told from his perspective, and that's the part I'm going to read. Joel was in the park. He had to save all the dandelions. They were at war against the birds. It was so good, this game. His name for it kept changing. Today, the weather was green. Today, he pushed out his tongue to check. The weather tasted of fresh. He was allowed 50 pushes on the swings. He couldn't ask his mum for more. It was already such a lot. At home later, they were going to watch a tiny bit of TV. They were going to have a tiny bit of chocolate. One of Joel's hobbies was to collect sticks from the park. If anybody saw a stick and it was shaped the same as a sword or a gun sword, Joel wanted to know about it. Shout. He collected answers to your questions. Joel Woods. 2. Salt and vinegar flavour. If you asked him, he would admit that he was scared of wild animals, robbers, monsters, some robots, but not if they had kind eyes. His mum was his best person, even when she was a tiny bit ready to stop playing. Joel knew how to count to 16. Beyond that, he knew how to guess. It was his birthday next July. He had none brothers, none sisters, none dads. He did have a bedroom of his own, and a religion, and a favourite cartoon, which was about another boy who was secretly magic. Joel's hope was, in the future, him and this other boy would meet. He had none cousins, none grandparents. His mum said, "I worry I'm not enough for you." Their favourite dinner was baked potato. Joel lived in the London borough of Enfield, in England, in Earth. If he ever got lost at the park, he was meant to find another grown-up with a child. They wouldn't know many facts about him. It would be Joel's mission to tell them the facts. His name, his age, what crisps he liked, what he collected, the enemies he was scared of, where he lived, how many turns he was allowed on the swings, what exactly had been agreed about TV and chocolate, all the conditions of his big life. Joel saw another bird. Right, you. He was the fastest boy alive, when he needed to be. He collected sound effects. He looked forward to later. He liked that it wasn't later yet.
Tom LAMONT, welcome to Shop Talk with Writers, our podcast. I'm so happy to meet you and to speak to you about this book, which, how dare you, made me cry a lot. And not only did it make me cry at the end, but also throughout. There were various spots, which I'm sure you know all about, but we'll get to that. But also your acknowledgements. Suddenly, the book is over and you're thanking people in your life, your professional life, your personal life. And then you reveal that you lost your dad in the middle of chapter 10. How far into the book is that? I can't even exactly
About
place
2/3 through.
2/3 through. I don't know how that affected your writing. Could you?
Yeah, a lot. And not just in the moment, but in the build-up. He was very, very ill for a long time. And it quickened and steepened towards the end, in the months towards the end. And throughout that whole period, I was writing this novel. And there are times when I read it now, or if I glance at certain passages from it now, I can see very much how that is in the mix of the composition. But there is also this sort of almost tide line in the book where I know the day he died. I know what I was writing that day. And because I wrote it more or less chronologically, I can see the little bit I wrote the morning of his death, and I can see the little bit I wrote the morning after his death. And there's this, in my life, a sort of huge Rubicon that's been crossed. And there's little subtle ways I can see that affected me and affected what I chose to write about. And although the finished manuscript of any novel has been edited and revised and played with, beyond recognition often from where it started, and it should be, I think. For me, I can see the texture, the grit, the elation as well. The weird moments of elation that were added by this sort of life experience I was going through at the time.
And in a way, your novel is about that, about fathers, about sons, about the masculinity in being a dad. In fact, I read your article in The Guardian where you used these two wonderful terms, dadhood and dadcraft. And this was about you being a dad and wishing you could share some of the stuff that you've learned as a dad with your father, and you no longer could. So the book opens, as you've just read, with Joel, who is a 2-year-old boy, who is absolutely instantly to fall in love with, and I did. How much of yourself is in that boy? Because you're writing, you're a wordsmith. There's not a single sentence, not a single image in the novel that I wouldn't describe as stunningly beautifully written. It's very alive. It's always surprising. It's never predictable, even when it could be. And so I was wondering, do you remember yourself at the age of 2 being that sort of boy?
I mean, first of all, thank you for saying all that. It makes my heart swell, really. I'm still in the early enough phases of all this to be just startled by responses like that from a reader. That's all you want, really, is for someone to feel those things about something you've written. I can't half want to cry, but thank you. I was not a charming 2-year-old, I don't think. Joel is, I think, quite good value, quite good fun. He's like my son. He's like the 2-year-old boy I was lucky enough to be able to raise. I think as a 2-year-old myself, I was whinier, less adventurous, more fearful. Somehow, I was quite a different child to my dad, and I have had quite a different child to me. That's I guess the magic of the game of parenthood, the roulette, the unpredictability of it. So there was, although there are characters in this book that are absolutely infused with my lived experience, with my views, with my anxieties, the boy I don't feel was drawn from 2-year-old Tom, because I don't have a great deal of affection for him, if I'm honest, whereas I absolutely, through both my recollections and my notes from the moment about raising my own son, I threw that all into describing Joel and sort of investing him with life.
So it didn't occur to me until very late in the book that it's really the idea of 2 different types of father in 2 different characters. One boy, no mother. 2 guys. One is very fatherly, not having ever had a child himself, lives for things that he feels dutifully responsible for, and is very loving, but in a sort of restrained way. And the other one is someone whose parents left him completely alone at the age of 18, and he decided to just live his life in the best way possible. And Theo, am I pronouncing it correctly?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. Theo is the responsible one. Ben is the one who's enjoying life and just basically living for himself. Both of them end up being connected with the boy. But then also there's Vic, who is Theo's father. So he's the grandfather figure. And he is the most surprising character of all because he falls in love with this boy immediately and will just keep him. Someone has to go on looking after him. And he, without even thinking about it, volunteers. How do you, is that a generational thing? How do you explain that instant knowing what he wants to do, what the right thing to do would be?
Yeah, so the book, as you beautifully described, the book that tells the story of these different figures who sort of circle a lost little boy, a boy without a parent to look after him. One of them is a 30-something man called Theo, very full of feelings of duty and responsibility in all aspects of his life, who sort of quite reluctantly shoulders the burden of this child, but does shoulder the burden. And then there's his best friend from school, Ben, who is more irresponsible, shall we say, narcissist, a bit of a bloody nightmare, who is involved with the boy's life and care, but is absolutely not doing it according to any sort of rhyme or reason or schedule. And then there's Theo's father, who's a generation older, who, in my mind and the way I imagined him, was quite a typical man of his generation in that he worked hard, he removed himself from a lot of domestic life when it was his own turn to raise children, that he possibly hurried through it all a bit, sort of not really thinking about it, and has now come to a point in his life in his 70s when he's reflecting on what he might have missed, what decisions he might do differently, at which point this little boy does come into his life through circumstances beyond all their control. And his response, like you say, is very different to Theo's, which is a sort of weary shouldering, and Ben's, which is a sort of light-hearted seeing how things go. In Vic's case, he falls kind of head over heels in love with this little boy and his energy. And as I imagine the character, I think I thought of him as seeing this as an opportunity to redo some of the decisions from the past and perhaps correct some of what he would see as mistakes.
There is a point when he actually puts this into words in front of an authority, and he's thought about it a lot, and he says something to the effect of, the second time around, you really do know what you're doing, no question, but the first time around, you don't. I think this book is also a lot about the mistakes that parents make, and the mistakes that children actually don't care that much about. So to digress a little bit, you wrote a piece in The Guardian, a long, long piece about possibly about why you wrote this book and how it came about. And there's this lovely moment in that piece where you say, well, you realize at some point that your dad actually did not give a shit about whether your room was tidy or not. And that something very different was important. And in the book and in the article, you also talk about the gaze, just watching the child, being connected, watching, making sure that they know you're there. Is that something I'm correctly picking up on, or am I reading too much into it?
What you learn through the doing, so you're almost always slightly too far behind because you've done it now and you sort of learned from your mistakes. And I don't even think it's a case that you learn quick enough to help with the next child along after your first, if you do have a first, or if you do indeed have more. I think it takes longer to process than that somehow, the overwhelming experience of parenthood, and you only really realize in hindsight what mattered, what didn't, what you fretted about, what you should have been fretting about, what was a waste of your emotional energy. I realized far too late that squabbling with my dad over the tidiness of a bedroom or the smartness of the shoes I was going to wear to grandma's house was a waste of our emotional energy. But in my view, it was just frittering. It was nothing. It was a focus on the wrong thing. And it's only through being a parent myself I understand that it was all in service of a larger lesson, which I did learn, which was about respect and about thinking about other people and about other people's needs and seeing the world through eyes that are not your own and being sensitive to other people's sensitivities. You see it now in the world. You see the people, many of whom are running whole countries, who were never taught these lessons. That's a fact. I don't need to know anything about their biography to know that. These are people who trample through whatever situation they're in because they never had a dad or a mum or a responsible figure of influence telling them stop, look around you, think about what those people are feeling in this moment. It's one of the concerns of raising children is to help them get to that place, I think.
I learned a term in your Guardian piece, which was a football term called man marking. Am I getting it right?
Yeah, man marking.
I had to ask someone what that actually is. And how does that apply to raising children, in your view?
So man marking, as I think of it, is when you get really close to a member of the opposition team in a football game to sort of stop them from getting the ball on a corner or a throw in or some sort of set play. It's basically being incredibly close to the person whose responsibility is yours. And I guess it feeds into what you referenced about gaze. It's about, I realized in hindsight, looking back on my decades so far of parenting, that the moments that really mattered, the moments that I think have had the best and most lasting effects were attention, presence, just care with what I was looking at and responding to. And it wasn't flashy outings or cool holidays or making them laugh or servicing them with goods and treats. It's presence, it's gaze, it's attention. A child craves nothing more than to be met on their level and not patronized and engaged with wholly. And I'm quite childish. I'm quite. I look very young, as you commented when we met, and I've never found it difficult to get on a level with kids. I think, which has helped me enormously as a father. But like anyone, I've got 1,000 distractions. I've got work. I've got my phone. All the blips and blips of modern life that are pulling me away from giving my gaze and attention to my children. And I've done it wrong. It's through doing it wrong that you learn almost as much or more than through doing it right. Or through doing it badly, you learn as much or more through doing it well. And all this is a long way of saying like any parent, I'm feeling my way, but I just have a strong sense of when it's been affirmative work rather than the opposite.
There are two very important female figures in the book. One is Sybil, who is the female rabbi in the community. And the other one is the mother, who is no longer there. And the other mother, who is no longer there, Theo's mother, Vic's wife. He's a widower. And both these women are beautifully drawn. One was going through a crisis to do with depression. And the other one is going through a different kind of crisis to do with faith, perhaps, and related issues. I was wondering, do you have experience in your own life with depression? Have you known anyone who's been in that situation?
Yeah. Fairly close contact with it, and having never had to wrestle with it to any serious degree myself, but having seen it from a very intimate distance, I just have quite a particular perspective that is definitely not unique, but is my own and true to my own sort of my own journey. Mm-hmm. And I felt confident enough working with those materials, even though I perhaps wouldn't have felt confident going too much further into the interiority of that experience without having experienced it to any depth myself. In terms of the other character wrestling with the loss of faith, yes, and I've definitely been through that myself on a reasonably low level, because the characters in my book are essentially secular Jews in North London. There is a rabbi who obviously is religious, and then the two younger men have come in and out of the religion. But it's the rabbi who's sort of struggling most with her faith, because it's come from a place of intensity to one of doubt. And although I was nothing like as a believer as someone who would choose to enter the institution in that way of becoming a rabbi, I was raised religiously Jewish as well as culturally Jewish, and I've made my own journey away from the religion, even while I feel very bound up in the culture still.
So Sybil and Ben connect in a very lovely, interesting, fun, I would say, mysterious way. And Ben is the one who actually loves showing the world that he is a Jew. He wants everyone to immediately see it, and he does not care how it affects people. So whatever he does, wherever he goes, whether it's a casino or the shops or a pub, he is who he is, and let people deal with that. And it's interesting that quality ultimately is connected with the decision he ends up making in terms of the boy. There is a moment where Sybil, the rabbi, has a moment when she's thinking she is the vehicle between the mother and whatever happens to the boy. She's involved in helping that situation. And the two potential carers for the boy are two very different young men who grew up together. One of them was in love with her, and one of them not exactly. But the decisions that are being made about responsibility for a child, responsibility for a family, responsibility for a community, they are actually intricately connected with what she herself calls a system of values, that when she was a much younger person, she decided, this works for me, this will help me live my life, I believe in it, it's a system of values. And that system somehow is the underlining sort of foundation for many of these apparently, sometimes misleadingly random decisions that these characters in your novel make, because actually all of them are led by something. Now, backtracking a little bit, Theo is an interesting case because his father is actually not a convert to Judaism, but very much involved in that progressive, or was it a liberal synagogue? I don't know, because he married a Jewish woman, and he grew up in foster homes in Scotland, got away from that, never really had a family, and he loves being a part of that.
The warm embrace.
Yes, you describe it as a warren.
A warren, yeah, for sure. The warren warmth of
the warren warmth
of a religious,
exactly. He sees Jews as a warren warmth, and he loves that. And Theo is somewhere in between those things, but he is. He has that sense of responsibility, which we don't know where he got that from. I suspect that unknowingly he did get it from his father. And at some point he does admit that when it's almost too late to say so. Do you actually think that the things that are not our personal life, that are beyond our personal life, can affect how we live within our families, within our one-to-one relationships as parents, as partners, as children?
I think there are inheritances that we're not necessarily aware of, certainly not very young, that aren't from direct experiences, but are somehow hereditary and somehow trickle down. I don't know how, whether it's in the body genetically, I'm less inclined to think that way, or whether it's through modeling behaviors, stories, anecdotes, warnings. encouragements that you get from older generations. So on my mother's side, this is a big North London Jewish family. I got loads out of that. I got a lot of my character was shaped by that, for good and for bad. You know, there's loads in Jewish culture that is just wonderful. It's like warm and fun and based around gathering and eating, feasting, really. But there's a lot about it that's incredibly anxiety-inducing and intense, and in my experience, directed towards fearing the worst, which isn't always a good way to approach the world. My dad's biography was incredibly different, similar to Vic in the book, in that he was raised Catholic and he grew up in state care, and he lost religion very young because of his experience being raised in a religious state institution. And he never had a family, never had anyone model anything for him really until he was very late in his teenage years, briefly informally fostered by a couple. And he always sort of felt that slightly saved him those couple of years that was when he was 16, 17. And then he moved to London very young on his own, totally alone, hundreds of miles, to enter the British Civil Service, which was kind of another form of state care in a way. They housed him, fed him, patronised him, supported him. And so he grew up at an unimaginable distance from my mum. When he met her in his 30s, he loved being welcomed in to her family, to her experience of the world, her religion, even though he couldn't feel the connection to any sort of God. And even though he wouldn't want to, he was irreligious. He loved the pomp and the warmth that we've discussed. And so if I think about me as a person, as a writer, I can see those two dual influences, and they've trickled down, and not purely positively, but also not absolutely not negatively. It's a blend. It's like anyone, there's a blend. And probably one of the questions you'll have noticed the book picks over is where the instinct to parent, where the knowledge of parenting comes from, because everyone the first time basically has to learn it on the fly overnight. They get struck by a responsibility that they have to answer, and you're probably tapping into really deep, quite weird stuff all the way through that journey. The one of the questions that I think hovers over my book, and certainly has hovered over my life, is how on earth my dad was able to be a good father to me when he had no father, when he had very little modelling of parenting at all. Where did that come from? How did he know what to do? I was like, I could look to him, and I could look to my grandfather and my maternal grandfather, but where did he get it from? And that's one of the questions I sort of explore in the book through these characters, because the Teo Vic dynamic shares a lot with me and my father.
You've been a journalist for how many years? I don't know.
20 years now.
Yeah, and you're a very accomplished journalist, and you write long-form journalism and interviews, and on a huge variety of topics. And on all of them, you write very, very interestingly. You have a very strong voice as a journalist, as a very strong non-fiction narrative voice. But in this novel, it's different. How did you discover or come to this voice, your fiction voice?
Thank you for saying that again about my journalism. Journalism, that's my job. It's sort of such a part of my identity, and has been for such a long time. It sort of absolutely has paid for everything, fed me, nourished me, given me friends and colleagues and mentors, and taught me how to write, and taught me how to be in the world and be empathetic. I owe a lot to that profession. It's always going to be a part of me. I'm always going to be a journalist. But I have been, for longer than I've been a journalist, I've been a reader of fiction. And I just always wanted to play in that sandpit as well. And long before I thought of being a journalist, I had the sort of childish dream of writing a novel. But in my case, that played out, that sort of the fuel for that, the patience for that played out really quickly and young. I tried a few things and they didn't work, and as my journalism career started to take shape, as I started to develop my toolkit as a journalist, I started to feel really rewarded by it. That became the kind of writer I was, and that is a really good way to, if you can make it work, is a really thrilling way to earn a living. At a certain point, around the time my daughter was born, so 11 years ago now, I just really felt that yearning again for the put aside ambition, for the unrealized dream of playing in the sandpit, of writing a novel that people might one day read and respond to as you've described responding to, which is why I find it that so intense. I tried simultaneously with my all-day job as a journalist. I tried to start feeding in some time just for writing fiction, and trying to basically find out what kind of writer I could be with that side of my professional self, because and that took time, and I think I definitely made mistakes.
What kind of mistakes?
Yeah, I'm very happy to talk about which, because I think initially my instinct was, well, I've got these attributes as a journalist, these skills I've learned. Why can't I directly apply them to writing fiction? And I would sort of write very much with a journalistic voice and a journalistic skew on the world, which is kind of like, there's a big picture reason I'm telling you this intimate story. That's sort of roughly the kind of journalism I do, that it's like you find a human story as a vessel to tell a bigger picture story. It works quite well. When things are clicking, it works well. And I think I tried the same as a questing novelist in training, trying to find my voice there. And it didn't work. And I learned that the hard way, because I worked on, over many months that added up to many years, one complete manuscript that I found met my agent through that manuscript, and we submitted it around the publishers of the UK, and no one wanted it. And so I learnt from that, the failure of that manuscript, sort of various things about what wasn't working in my sort of voice and my angle of entry. And then I went away and wrote another manuscript, months into years of work, that again we sent around, finished, shaped, sent around, and again nobody wanted. And so through those two processes of building towards the completion of a sort of hopeful nascent piece of art, sending it around, seeing it sent back unwanted, you have to learn. You learn a lot.
What sort of feedback did you get? Why did they say no?
It was all over the place, but all reasonable and correct. These weren't two masterpieces that were being ignored. These were deeply flawed creative projects, as I think they sort of have to be early on. You have to try and fail. And so the responses were, there would be remarks about tone, there would be remarks about shape, pace, unsatisfying elements, and yeah, I mean, just about everything, which does make the process of submission, rejection, and responding quite difficult, because reading is a subjective game, and every reader responds differently to a piece of prose. And the idea that you're going to learn something from 12 individual readers, no, you're going to learn how that individual reader felt. And when it's an editor rejecting one of your manuscripts, you certainly receive a lot of information back, but it tends to contradict itself. And my process of dealing with that was to really zero in on an editor with the second failed manuscript, who took time. Two editors took some time to take me out, to speak to me, to sit me down and say, basically, there is some talent here, there's some promise here. This book isn't working, and these are the reasons we feel it isn't working, but give it another go. But for that conversation and that time they took to tell me that, I might have stopped and gone back purely 100% to journalism. But I went round again one more time, and the same process, months into years, finishing a manuscript. And that was this book. And that's the one I felt throughout the whole process had a cleaner shape, a firmer intention. And it was to wind back a very long answer to your initial question. It was also the manuscript that was furthest away from my journalist persona, from my journalist sound. And it was also the furthest away in terms of angle or the way that the world is grasped, because this book isn't about sort of some social cry. It isn't about, it's given that it's a novel about raising a 2-year-old boy who doesn't immediately have anyone else to raise him. It is not a book about cuts to government services. It's not a book about overwhelmed social workers. It's a book about, it's a very close over the shoulder book about individuals being faced with a task, with a dilemma, with a drama. And right away I could feel it as it came out of my fingers. It just felt different, and it felt realer, it felt warmer, and it felt further away from my journalism, which I also, to finish my point, my long point, I knew it was different and working in a different way, because the writing of this book wasn't really taking away in any way from the energy or the hours I could also write journalism. It was almost like I was just tapping into a different part of the spine to write it and create it. It was like, I'm borrowing from Virginia Woolf here, who had a lovely line in her diary about the difference between journalism and writing fiction being like turning over the pillow. And it was exactly like that for me in this case, because it just felt like I could do one, turn over the pillow, and do the other, and they weren't depleting from each other. If anything, there was a kind of nice sort of service from one to the other to sustain.
Were the earlier attempts the ones that didn't succeed, including In Your Own Eyes, on different topics? Is this a completely new theme and topic?
Yeah, some of the characters or sort of very vague relationships from the second book I pulled out, kind of at on the advice of I don't know why I'm not using names. The two editors who took me aside, I'll forever be grateful to. Francesca Main, who runs Phoenix, and Fede Antonino, who at the time was at WNN and has now taken over Scepter. And it was Fede ultimately who bought this book, and it's Scepter who brought the book out. And Fede and I have worked really, really closely on it, and we've got this really lovely, creatively fertile editor-writer relationship. But Francesca and Fede took me aside, and they said basically, the journalist you, the Guardian you, is the least appealing part of this sort of bad manuscript. But what's working is this dynamic between a 30-year-old man and a small boy. These were different characters, but I really heard that, and I knew also that I knew that part to be true, because at the time it was the dynamic I was having with my 2-year-old boy. And I just sort of peeled that out of the bad manuscript and just placed it in the part of London I grew up in, gave it much more of me, much less of the world. And so there's the book. I think it's always worth writers talking about the failures before, because
of course
these things don't just appear, they don't just come out, and so
they feed into the new thing.
Yeah, they make you who you are, and I was brought up short on this in the best possible way by David, another Scepter writer, David Mitchell, who wrote Cloud Atlas, and he's been really lovely to me. And I very glibly said something, described like the wasted efforts or the wasted time of my failed previous manuscripts, and he was instantly on me. He just said, "No, not wasted. You're creating the mulch on which you wrote the next one." And he's right, I think.
I think, especially for accomplished journalism writers, to go into fiction requires an emotional fearlessness that as a journalist you don't really need to have. You can have curiosity, you can have another kind of courage, but that emotional fearlessness to actually connect your writing with who you are very deeply and just go there, go to the innermost you. That's where the real writing comes out, and it really has. And how has the process of being edited as a fiction writer, as opposed to as a journalist, the relationship with editors in each field, has it been different? Would you describe it as a different kind of process?
When it's working, I love this relationship, and I've learned, I was lucky because I could really iron out the kinks of it as a journalist. But I started being a journalist really young, in my very early 20s, and I was even a young 21-year-old, emotionally and intellectually, and so I used to really respond very, very badly, childishly, to being edited, and in any way, in any way, and I would throw tantrums, I would get frustrated, I would quit in my head over and over and over again. And the one advantage of that happening quickly and young was that I really worked my way through that over time. And by the time I was in these processes as a junior novelist, being edited by fiction editors, I'd come to absolutely believe in, surrender to, trust in the editorial process, the process of revision. I see it as absolutely fundamental. You basically create, in my experience, and also I think in the experience of the writers I really admire, you work to create the mulch, to use Mitchell's term, and you'll then work it. You let your editor work it. You show it to trusted readers. You let them respond, and you're basically trying to get the prose to tell you what it wants to be, and that comes through revision and through editing. And so I was lucky. I'd got to a point as a writer where I understood that where it's not an insult if you find the right editor, if you have a productive relationship. It's a bad sign if they're not wanting you to change stuff. It shouldn't be too easy. There should be resistance. There should be questions. There should be someone pointing a finger at a lazy bit of the manuscript and saying again. And it's pride wounding. That's why people don't want to hear it. And I've, believe me, had my pride wounded a million times and will continue to. But when you get through that, it's like, once the scab of that comes off, there's a healing, and there's an improvement and a strengthening, and I think that was a terrible medical reference there. I should have said, once you're inoculated by it, you can't. You have your little bit of the pox, and then you get better, you get stronger over time. But so I really believe in and am moved by the editorial process when you're with the right, and when you feel like you're in the right hands, and you feel like you're strengthening the product, the art. But it takes trust, it takes surrender, and you have to make mistakes as well. I'm so grateful still that someone is wrangling with my book and publishing it and has brought it out, that I'm probably pretty quick to take all suggestions and say yes. And maybe there's a kind of case for sometimes just placing your feet far apart and saying, I'm gonna keep that, I'm gonna hold that.
Are you working on another novel now?
Yeah, pretty much straight away. I don't know how you have approached this or how other people approach this, but I felt really strongly, and was told this as well actually by other authors, that there's a value in getting going immediately or as soon as possible before the book, before your last book comes out, to use that kind of lull when the manuscript's ready, when it's off and out of your hands and really out of your control, to use that time to get going on the next project, because it's quite quiet, it's quite sort of chilly, that period, and it's both good for the distraction to be working on something else, and it's probably the last time for a while that your brain's going to be totally empty of the last of the previous book, the previous work. So as it is now, I'm working on this on a second novel every day. But as we're talking, I'm thinking about the old one. I'm putting myself back there. You're kind of you're juggling the two universes, which can be, you can make mistakes. You can forget things. One can bleed into the other. But sorry, yes, I am writing another one. Yeah.
We're recording this at your home, which is in a beautiful part of North London. But you mentioned that you grew up where the novel takes place, which is Enfield, which is farther north in North London. And I have to say, your Enfield, your fictional Enfield, is so wonderfully recreated or created or reimagined in the book. It's like a character in the novel, and it kind of reminds me of, I don't know, Philip Roth's New Jersey. It's that real. It has, and you go through the seasons and through various characters and moments, and it's so, for me, it reaffirms what I believe is that there is absolutely no irrelevant place on this earth. No city, no village, no street corner is irrelevant. Everything has a beauty and a history and a story, and you bring that out. That's like it's an unnamed character, but actually it is named in pretty much every scene, and it almost makes you want to live there. I know people who do. I'd like to, now we're going to hear some rustling, and that rustling is the pages of your book. I'm going to look at some spots which I had planned on asking you about. So what I found very interesting is that your chapters you divide the chapters into the characters' names. So there's Ben, there's Theo, there's Vic, there's Sybil, and that's it, right? There's no one else. Mm-hmm. So and your story continues, it progresses, but each time you kind of pause a little bit and you look at that world, that same world, but from the point of view of a different character. And the way they interconnect, that's what I found so really masterful. So whatever your editors made you do.
Say thank you.
Thank them. So in this chapter, which is Ben, he says to himself, the world made room for every type of man, he thought. And he realized that he's different from others. He functions differently from others. He makes decisions the way he wants to. And he's fine with that. He has no guilt whatsoever. And he's kind of a neglected young man who has no purpose in life, has lots of money, can do whatever he wants. I think he's trying to find his way, and maybe if it hadn't been for this situation with Joel, he probably wouldn't have, but the way he's saying the world made room for every type of man, that's also what your novel is about. There are different types of men in the story, and they each have a role to play. Also, the emptiness that Leah, the mother, shared, her emotional, psychological emptiness that she shared with Sybil when she came to see her, that's so strong. And I think that is when you begin, as a reader, you begin to basically weep because you think, should she have overcome it? Should she made an effort? Could she have? And you realize, no, we can only do what we can do. And she was already saying he should have a parent like you, a parent who believes in something, who is sure. So she wasn't sure. Is that uncertainty something that you've experienced in your life? Where did you take that from?
Yeah, I think you constantly believe that you're the only uncertain one and that everyone else is surer.
Yeah.
And one of the wonders of fiction is that you can move between people's experience. You can put the reader in different shoes, and you can start to see and play with the idea that kind of everyone has their own distinct menu of insecurities and worries. Although perhaps that's one of the most unifying, this idea that everyone else has their shit together. And in that case, she's visiting her rabbi, and she says, I'm paraphrasing, but she says, I want to be more like you, or it would seem to me a secure way to be a parent, to be more like you, if I was as sure as you. Whereas, of course, little does she know that her rabbi, Sybil, is having tremendous doubt and is asking all sorts of questions about her own decisions in life, and feels these great absences herself.
So this very literary narrative manner of going inside your characters and inside the characters who these characters think they see, but they don't. You see them better. You know, the control that you have over the entire narrative and all the narratives is just excellent. And I think this is what readers will really appreciate when they come across this, because it's what we deal with in life. We never really know how unhappy the other person is, no matter how happy they may seem.
It's an argument for empathy. It's just all of fiction. I think if we're sitting by my bookshelves, right, and there's like however many books up there, and it's all just a collective argument for empathy. You put yourself in other people's shoes. Think for a second what it is like to live the world in another way. That's fiction's purpose to me, and that has a real social value. And so much is lost when people don't read books, read novels, read fiction. I think because you're not taken out of your own blinkered, very railed individual experience. You're not forced to wrestle with other people's countering experiences.
As you can see, I have lots of little notes here.
Yeah,
but
you've
I'm
absolutely.
Not going,
I mean, that's like full of post-its. I love it.
am not going to refer to all of them at all.
It looks like a sort of dinosaur. It's like you turned it into a kind of stegosaurus. I love it.
We kind of covered most of it. I just want to say this simple thing, which is Vic's thinking as he's looking at the boy. He's thinking that the child's enthusiasms had become the household's enthusiasms as he moved into his flat and with Theo staying there as well. And he's saying, "Stay with us," Vic thought. Just stay with us, and that simplicity of knowing what's right, what he felt, what he wanted, what he didn't really have to consider at all. I think maybe that's what you got from your father, just knowing how to be a parent, how to care. And to me, that was the heart of the story.
Because of course Vic doesn't express it; he thinks it.
No,
and I think he has the affliction of that generation where they were taught to suppress because it was weak to show emotion or to reveal what you're thinking or feeling. And one of the losing someone has all sorts of strange fringe advantages. Sounds like a crazy word, but I mean it is kind of like it forces an adjustment of relationships, and probably brings out a lot more honesty because you suddenly feel a sense of time running out, both when you're the one preparing to leave and the one preparing to be left. And it took a long time, I think, before my father and I would use certain language with each other. Would talk in certain ways. And I think probably some of that was him having to, he was very demonstrative, loving father. We kissed, we hugged, we were tactile with each other. I always knew he loved me. Always. But I think for some reason, at a certain point, puberty on my part, some clunk came in where I wouldn't tell him I loved him. I don't know why. And it was this sort of unspoken thing. And then as you realize it's almost over, your relationship is almost over, has run its course, you go back to a much freer way of expressing love that might have existed when between a smaller child and their father. And so I was just after that kind of. This is ultimately a book about men and their strange codes and the mistakes, endless mistakes, the copied mistakes, the imitated mistakes. And one of those, I think, is one of those mistakes is that inferred or imitated sense that you must hide weakness, that you must not show weakness, and even further than that, the total misapprehension that feelings are allied with weakness, that to talk about vulnerability, to talk about the things you love or fear, or that's somehow to put yourself at a disadvantage. He would have felt that way because of the way he grew up. Vic would have felt that way because of the way he grew up. I was raised in a totally different way, and I've come of age in a very different society, and I just feel the sort of flush through with the benefits of that. And so in that relationship between the older Vic and the younger Theo, I really wanted to try and get after the different ways that they ran up against masculinity and received codes of that.
Are you the lucky generation then?
Possibly, yeah, because I was born in 1982, so we came of age at a time when I think a lot of that was loosening. Those ideas about gendered kind of codes of behavior were loosening. The internet hadn't quite come along yet, so we got to have a fairly undisturbed youth. I really think of the internet as us as like straddling generation. The internet clanged in when we were late teenagers, as did mobile phones. So you kind of had a bit of the before and a bit of the after, and I don't feel like we were the generation that had experiments performed on them by quick moving technology. I think that was the poor guys who came later. So I think there's a lot I'm grateful for. I really am grateful I didn't grow up in a society like my dad's, where to not be physically strong, to not be taciturn, to not, to show where to sort of shed a tear would have just been, an absolute loss. That I'm glad that there was less of that when I was growing and maturing. I went to a mixed school. I had loads of women friends. Benefited enormously from that. I met my wife in my late 20s, and that just had a huge effect on my character and my sort of expansive vision. I started reading way more women, almost exclusively women for a time, and all these things, I think, to my benefit, helped me see through a lot of that masculine patriarchal coding that insists on certain sort of strictures and behaviors that ultimately just cost the people who have to or do adhere to them. But we're sitting here as the world changes around us in really seismic ways, and I think part of the change that we're feeling, and I am responding to very badly, and I expect you are too, is a remasculization of commentary, of culture, of politics. I really quiver at it. I hate it. It's so transparent. It's so lame. That kind of posturing, the idea of no weakness at any cost. It's so dumb. It's so two-dimensional. And like I said before, I feel that one of the forces that works against it is art. Is an art that engages with a realer humanity. Oh man, I've forgotten what you asked at the beginning.
It really doesn't matter, but what you just said, your novel, Going Home, does all that beautifully, and I'm sure your readers will, not just in the UK, but it's coming out in the States and in translations. I think people will connect with it very deeply. So thank you very much, and thank you for this conversation, Tom Lamont. Thank you for speaking to Shop Talk.
Thank you very much.
I'm Elena Lapin, and this has been the latest episode of Shop Talk with Writers. Tom Lamont's novel is published by Scepter in the UK and by Knopf in the US. As always, you can read more on my Substack. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and share Shop Talk with Writers with anyone interested in these conversations with authors about the stories behind their books. We look forward to your comments. Our next podcast will feature best-selling Italian author Elena Ferrante's renowned translator Anne Goldstein, among other special conversations. Thank you so much for listening.
Це ще моцно.